Probably one of the biggest highlights of any tour of the summit is coming up here on the roof, where you can really see the whole footprint of the school, reflect on its history, not to mention it is such a beautiful view. So from this front perspective, you can see this layout. Remember, it was all green when Sister Julia selected this in 1888. You can see the football field. We talked about how it was realigned at one point off towards O'Brienville this way. Again, the great stories from the early students in the 1890s in those first few classes talking about O'Brienville was the end of the streetcar tracks. And so the girls would get dropped off on Grandin and Madison, and then a wagon would go pick them up. I was just reading something in the 1940 yearbook from a little girl who writes in the yearbook that she was the first student who had a grandma who was an alumni, I believe in 1893, and then a mom who was an alumni. So she's writing this in 1940. She's a third grader, reflecting on comparing everything. And she talked about her grandma talking about being picked up there in the wagon and wearing these black serge dresses, which is what they had before they got to the uniforms in the 1920s. And then there are also the stories from one of the first graduates in 1893, where she talks about the sisters bringing the students up here at night for astronomy classes, and how when they would be coming through the area of Walnut Hills into O'Brienville and see William Howard Taft before he was, of course, vice president, and on the Supreme Court. And, he was a very friendly, large gentleman. One of the things I remember about O'Brienville was up through the 80s, there was a corner mom and pop store called Ree's there that we'd all walk down to after school, and I'm sure any alum from that time frame would remember that. If you transition looking over to where Flannery is now, that's where there was that little stream and the stone bridge that the kids referred to as the Mississippi, and there's some great pictures there. This was, of course, before Flannery was built in the mid 80s. There was the baseball diamond was there, and there was a lovely big old house that was right there facing Grandin. So you had the baseball field and another little green field, and then that private space. Probably one of the real hallmarks of the summit experience, which I hope you all get to have at some point, is hearing the bell named Immaculata ring. It was put in 1892, rang for the first time July 1st, 1892, and for years, decades, it called the sisters to prayer. It announced important ceremonies like graduation. For a long time through the late 20th century, Immaculata was silent. In 1990, she did ring for the centennial, and then again was broken and repaired, and actually has rung for the last few years, sometimes for the beginning of the school year. In September of 2020, she was rung again for the 130th birthday celebration of the summit. And then hopefully she will ring again at graduation. Immaculata was constructed by the very renowned Cincinnati-based Verdon Bell Company, which is internationally known in its history. Has a great little story if you'd like to look at their website, and several generations from that family have attended the summit. So here is this fabulous view of Cincinnati, of the Ohio River. As we talked about in our first episode, you can really geographically see the lay of this city and how it all goes around that river. And think about in 1848, the sisters coming here for the first time down the Ohio River. You can see downtown from this area. You can again also see this footprint of the school. So we have over here the middle school area, and you kind of come over to this side, you can see where the pavilion was. Off to the side of where the middle school is today, this is where that boys' school was. And there was another hidden building, I guess you could call it, another building that's no longer there, that many Summit alums from the 40s through the 90s remember as Warner Hall. And that was the boys' school theater. It was wooden sided. I have this memory that it looked kind of like a barn. That may not be accurate, but that's where all of the boys' school plays were. There was a stage, a lot of assemblies were in there, and that's also where a lot of the boys and girls' school, the 7th and 8th grade mixers would have been through the late 20th century. As we come along over here, you get that wonderful view of what was the Alpha, and then where the two buildings were that we now have just the one as the Montessori and the lower school. Again, that was put in the mid-2000s. So this is a view of the chapel that very few people actually get to see. When we were in there, we talked about how Durang really made use of the natural light and put the oriented the chapel in a certain way to receive the natural light, and put the stained glass windows in to really benefit from that. From this perspective, you can see the architecture, you can see the flying buttresses, but what you can also see are the little windows that are built in to the chapel roof that allows the light to come in for those windows. When you're inside the chapel, they're way high up, and there's a whole row of stained glass windows that very few people even really look at, that's just more colored as opposed to having any specific pictures. But one of my favorite things is, if you look over here on this side, there's a little door. That's how you get up to the level where those little windows are. And former campus historian and English mentor, Pat Kelly, would talk about how when he had been on the summer working crew, the only way you could get over there was to kind of swing and jump over there, because that's the only entrance into it. And I've never been able to do that, but I'm sure it's a fabulous perspective of the chapel and the architecture and the light. So from over here, this is St. Cecilias, and you can see the stained glass and the little windows above. These are the storage areas that people always hear about that are above St. C's. And there's just some fascinating architectural detail where you can see places like this where they're built to let light in. So where Springer is today, that was Marion High School, which is now part of Purcell Marion. They didn't merge until the 1980s. And actually there's a great little story that really shows the independence of the Sisters of Notre Dame. Because at one point, the Archdiocese wanted us to become an archdiocesan school. And the sisters were very adamant that while, of course, working hand in hand with the Archdiocese, that they were an independent community. And so the Archdiocese put in Marion in the hopes that it would drive Summit out of business. It didn't. And today now we have both schools with very different formats, but both successful. Another fun little story is there was a church that was over here and some huge mansions. And there's a great story about Charles Dickens when he came to Cincinnati on a visit. Well documented. If you've been up to the Golden Lamb in Lebanon, they have one of the places where he stayed there. But he stayed down here, or was hosted down here. And the gentleman that owned this home where he was visiting told him this story about a woman who had been jilted at the altar and had kind of, gone into a depression and a psychosis. And supposedly that's what Dickens turned into the story of Miss Havisham in Great Expectations.